Welcome to today's webinar. Please note that today's call is being recorded. Before we begin, we have a few housekeeping items. Except for the speakers, all participants' lines are muted. During the presentation, you may enter a question at any time simply by typing it in the chat box on your screen and then clicking the send button. We will save time near the end to respond to questions sent during the presentations along with others that are submitted during the Q&A portion. I will now turn it over to Jasmine Hall Ratliff, Deputy Director of Keisha Harris and Associates.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the third InDEEP Closing the Gap webinar, which is the third in a four-part series. We're delighted that you've joined us, and we hope that what you learned today will aid you in advancing a more equitable funding environment for climate and conservation organizations led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and communities most impacted by the environmental crises. This webinar will discuss the interconnection of racial equity and climate justice. These two issues are often addressed separately, but as many of you on the call know, racially marginalized and disadvantaged groups are typically the most at risk for environmental harm and also least likely to have access to resources required to mitigate challenges within their communities. We cannot advance climate change mitigation and climate justice in a system deeply embedded with racial inequities. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our panelists. Their more extensive bios will be on the InDEEP website with the recording of the webinar. Nataki Osborne-Jelks is a nationally recognized leader in engaging urban communities and youth of color in environmental stewardship through hands-on watershed and land restoration initiatives, environmental education, and training. In 2001, Nataki co-founded the Atlanta Earth Tomorrow program, National Wildlife Federation's multicultural youth environmental education and leadership development program that engages urban youth in investigating causes of environmental challenges, helps them connect to nature, fosters their leadership of youth-led community action projects, promotes civic engagement, and nurtures leadership skills for building environmental stewardship. Jason Swan works as a land policy analyst, ensuring Westerners have equal access to land, wildlife, and water. Specifically, his area of expertise includes analyses on equitable access to public open spaces, access to decision-making, and managing and limiting access in a fair manner for natural resource protection. After a long stint in the financial services industry, he dedicated his life to the service of others through adventure, healing, and environmental advocacy, and as such, founded Rising Rock, where they envisioned the world as it might be, empowering action and leadership that will positively impact our collective social, systemic, and environmental future. And lastly, Erica R.K. Vincent brings over a decade in environmental, climate, and social justice nonprofit work to the Powershift Network. Going by the pronouns she and her, Erica self-identifies as an eco-womanist, committed to the intersectional fight for climate justice through her spiritual and moral connection to creation, Black women, and people of the African diaspora globally. Erica's professional and personal passion is to provide resources and in-depth leadership development for communities of color, including, but not limited to, historically Black colleges and universities like her beloved alma mater, Spelman College. Nataki, Jason, and Erica, it's a pleasure to be with you today here. Our goal for this webinar is to share approaches and strategies from equity-centered re-granting intermediaries in a moderated discussion of skills, resources, and business models required to successfully serve and support climate organizations with an equity-focused approach. With that in mind, I'd like to invite our participants to respond to the following polling questions. So we'll have two questions that get posted up, and if you could respond according to what you have going on in your own organization. First, we have been funding BIPOC organizations for so many years. Please make your selection, and we'll wait a few seconds. Okay, Tahani, if you could go ahead and share the results and give one more second to anyone who wants to answer. So we see the majority of those who responded, or about 50% of those who responded, are relatively new to this space, with the rest of the balance out to 5 to 10 and 15 plus years. So thank you for those who responded to the question. Our second poll is, what percentage of your portfolio are organizations that are BIPOC led? All right, we'll give it a few more seconds for anyone who wants to still respond. All right, so out of those of you, about 60% of you who have responded, the majority again are in the lower end of the range, so 1 to 25%. There's some who don't know, and then others who are at 25 to 50%, and then one person responded that their portfolio consists of organizations at 75 to 100% that are BIPOC led. So great, this gives our speakers a little bit of a sense of who's in the room, the virtual room. And thank you for everyone who has responded. All right, so we're gonna start out with questions for the panel, and each person will respond with their thoughts, and we'll have some questions where everyone will respond. We'll have others where we'll direct it to one individual and then ask others to respond to that person. And then we'll definitely save time for questions. But in the meantime, if you hear something that sparks a question in your mind, definitely please put it in the chat, because we don't want anyone to lose their question, and we want to have a record of it so that when we get to the Q&A, we'll be sure to address your question. Feel free to also comment in the chat box on anything you hear about that helps to spark some conversation, so that when we get to the portion of Q&A and discussion, Tahani will just help me read through what we have there, and hopefully we'll have some good conversation. So the first question is for each of you to respond. What are some of the intersectional challenges of racism and climate change facing BIPOC communities? And let's start with Nataki, please.
Somehow I knew you were going to start with me. Thank you so much for having me. But when I think about, these intersectional challenges, when we think about climate change, we know that nobody is immune. We're all being impacted really across the globe. But I like to think about it in this context that we are all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. Climate change is something that disproportionately impacts communities of color, whether we're talking about in the United States or worldwide. And those impacts are far-reaching. We know that BIPOC communities are often hit first and worst by climate change. And as we think about, how climate change is layered, if you will, with disparities that we see as a result of systemic racism across this country, that would be something that we have to, definitely keep in mind. In fact, I've been doing some research lately that has been focused just on one area related to climate change, and this is on the impacts of urban heat islands. And so while we generally know that urban heat islands are something that can impact lots of people, in densely populated, urban centers, places that are highly urbanized, what we can also see if we, kind of trace things, is that because of the impacts of systemic racism, because of the racism that has shaped planning policies in cities, the communities that are often most impacted by extreme heat and by these urban heat islands are BIPOC communities, communities where investments have not been made in critical infrastructure, natural infrastructure like parks and green space. like, open space, these things that help to reduce, some of the risk associated with, living in an urban area. And so because of racism, and this is just one example, but we could take a number of things. We could, also talk about, the communities that live closest to pollution generating facilities, who are impacted, by things like, extreme heat, but also by, the storms and hurricanes and extreme weather events. The same communities, each time we talk about these impacts, we're talking about the same communities that are being disproportionately impacted. And unfortunately, when we talk about climate change, we can't just talk about it in the context of natural disasters and extreme weather events. We have to talk about the unnatural disasters that are advanced because of systemic racism and how racism has embedded itself in our society. So I'll stop there. I know that other panelists have other things to add to that.
Thanks, Nataki. Jason, how about you?
Thank you for that, and welcome everyone. I always like to lead with, I started in such an early phase of my life and actually getting into this work. And when I say early, I mean just recently getting into this work. And because of an incident that actually happened to me that really woke me up to the disparities of our judicial system and made me move away from a state that I didn't feel any connection with. When I got to Colorado, I really found peace in the melodic powers of the outdoors, and it really healed me. I found peace in it. And what happens when you do that and you fall in love with a place, you get more curious about it and you want to figure out more about it. And as I started doing this work with Western Resource Advocates just about a year ago, I started learning the unjust policies that have historically literally have hurt people of color. And I started learning about redlining and forced migration and just understanding how that has affected us and moved us in areas that, as a panelist just mentioned, have redlined our communities and created more heat waves and heat islands rather. And so I started learning that we don't have access to these natural open spaces. And just did some recent research as well, and that learning about, how 100 million people do not live within a 10-minute walk of a park. And I'm not talking about just any park, I'm talking about a quality park, right? It doesn't make sense for me to go to a park and it doesn't have anything that actually benefits the community. It needs to have quality. And learning that 70% of communities of color in the United States live in nature-deprived places. And so I really wanted to find a way to be able to solve for that through the Outdoor Equity Grant Program, which has been actually utilized both in Colorado, that just recently passed, New Mexico, and also California. And so those are just some of the areas that I'm really focusing in on. But now I'm getting to this point now where I'm thinking about green gentrification, right? Now that you have these beautiful spaces, or even if your community fought for these spots and turn a waste facility into a green space, or had a biking lane now put through it, or whatever your community did to fight for these resources and this green infrastructure, now is actually forcing them away and pricing them out of their homes. And so how do we keep our communities in these areas and not be forcibly removed or priced out of their homes? And so that's where I'm starting to move into now. That green is not always, climate change is not necessarily beneficial if we're not really doing like an equity audit to ensure that our people are still in those places once it does get fixed. And with that, I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Jason. And that is what a paradox that you're trying to bring more green spaces to an underserved area, and now people are moving in for the green spaces and pricing out those who are already there, who work to bring the green spaces there. That's interesting. Erica, how about you?
Yeah, so much has already been said, and thank you so much for having me, and thank you for joining us, everyone. I'll just add, I'm so glad that Jason mentioned the green gentrification piece, because that's so interesting to think about. Once a place is mitigated or once amenities are afforded to a certain area, then it becomes profitable, right? Then it becomes a place that people want to be. It's like, oh, well, that place doesn't have, you know, amenities or resources or whatever, so I don't want to live there. And then once those things are starting to be poured into the community, then it's, oh, okay, now I want to live there. Now we want to bring more, you know, more resources. Now, you know, we have I have friends that I live in Georgia, live in Atlanta, or live in the Atlanta area. And I have friends that, you know, they'll change the name of a section of Atlanta. And I have friends that are born and raised in Atlanta. They're like, that's not what that section is called, but now it's chic. Now it's profitable and attractive to live in this area. So now it's got a new, you know, funky name, and there are new amenities that are there and things like that. So that's so interesting that Jason mentioned that, and I absolutely agree. And then Nataki already talked about, you know, resources as well, and how systemic racism leads to not only the extraction of resources in our communities, but also the placing of our communities when it comes to redlining and things like that. I was looking at, I was in a presentation once and someone was mentioning how a city, I think it was Atlanta, but it may have been another city, that, you know, back in the day, you know, I'm not sure about timing, so please forgive me, but when this city was being designed, you know, the more affluent or wider neighborhoods were put kind of higher elevations, and the more poor or Black neighborhoods were put in lower elevations. And, you know, that was directly contributing to the flooding in the Black community. I'm trying to remember what city that was, so forgive me, but I'm trying to highlight, what I want to highlight though is the pure infrastructure of cities and the way that cities were designed and the way that they are continued to be poured into, you know, directly focuses or directly sheds light on, I should say, how climate change is affecting different people. And I love Nataki's analogy about us not all being in the same boat. And so literally, if you're at a lower elevation than another neighborhood that's, you know, a suburb, you literally are seeing how the people at lower elevation are in a different boat, because it's being experienced in a different way. And they're being, you know, there is flooding happening or other things, other climate change mitigation that's not happening in a different way. I can also say, oh, thank you, Nataki. That is Atlanta. I can also say the same for my hometown. I'm from Newark, New Jersey. And when all of the rain was happening earlier this year, when the hurricane had gone northward, not earlier this year, last month, and the hurricane had gone northward, I was seeing, you know, I was having to call my family members in New Jersey to make sure they were okay. But I went to high school in Morristown, New Jersey, which is up on a mountain. It's like literally, that city is literally a mountain. And so when calling my friends from high school to say, you know, or texting them to be like, are y'all all right? They're like, yeah, we're just getting some rain. But when talking to my family and friends in Newark, which is definitely a lower elevation, more flat, they're like, you know, our basement was flooded, or this was flooded, the lower level of our apartment building was flooded, and we had to do X, Y, and Z. And so literally we're looking at how infrastructure causes climate change to affect people in different ways. And then I'll just end with, because both of Nataki and Jason said so many poignant things, I don't want to be redundant, but I'll also end with, you know, I always say, or I had a colleague say to me when I worked at a previous organization, you know, people are experiencing multiple pain points at the same time. You know, you don't have poverty on Monday and climate change on Tuesday and so on and so forth. People are experiencing these things at the same time, and they're interlocking and piling on top of each other. So when we think about Katrina, which happened, you know, what is that? 10, 15 years ago. When we're thinking about Katrina, and that was right around when I was applying to college. So that was like, what, 2005, I think. We're thinking about how people had to evacuate, and people say certain things. You know, I had a Spelman sister say to me, someone at her job said, you know, well, I don't understand why people don't just leave. You know, why don't they just evacuate? Why don't they just get out? And it's like, okay, well, what is evacuating? What does that entail? That entails transportation, that entails having a place to stay, that entails, you know, if your family doesn't live right there, or if you're all in the same boat, y'all all got to go to a hotel. How much does a hotel cost? Hotel costs don't necessarily go down because there was a natural disaster. You know, what is transportation? How are people being able to get out of their communities? You know, do people have cars, or is it only public transportation? Well, public transportation doesn't work if we're in a flood, you know, so all of those things are multiple pain points: infrastructure, transportation, poverty. So many things are happening at the same time. And so that is how, you know, the intersectional ways of climate change, of systemic racism, are compounded by climate disasters and climate change in ways that people are experiencing that. It's not just rain and natural disasters, it's also heat. We know in the global South, there are, you know, record numbers. We're having record numbers of heat here, but we're thinking about the global South and record numbers of heat. Then we're also thinking about agriculture and how that, you know, contributes to that, when there are countries that a large part of those countries' financial infrastructure is dependent on agriculture. And if there's a drought or extreme heat that kills certain plants that they are dependent on for the livelihood of their citizens, that on the flip side can also be a problem. So it's all compounding, and people are experiencing multiple pain points globally that climate change just adds on to when it comes to the lens of systemic racism, for sure.
Yeah, thank you very much, Erica. Thanks to all of you. And we're going to move on to the second question, and we'll start with Jason to respond, and then others can reflect based on what they hear. How should foundations look differently at climate change in light of these intersectional challenges?
Oh, foundations. You know, again, I always like to give people a perspective of where I'm coming from, because it's really helpful, because this is someone who has just got into and able to see and work with foundations. And it's been a very interesting experience. I can't say that I've had a very bad experience. I don't think that at all. But I do think as it relates to resources, there's never going to be enough. In my opinion. And I always think that we are so worthy and deserving of it in the first place, that we should, you know, have it all, in my opinion. And want to get to a point where I don't need a grant, to be honest with you, because what it really looks like for me, as far as, you know, financial independence, I don't come to a foundation for any money. It's not something that I need or want to even have personally. So that's kind of my vision, even for my own organization and the people that I serve. But with all that being said, you know, I guess for me, it's just, how are you measuring change, either towards or away from equality, that has a focus on all the things that we just talked about, whether it be food safety, workforce development, any of these issues, infrastructure, and the environment, obviously. And I really, and I guess to answer the question, you know, I just think that community engagement, there's so much repair that needs to be done with BIPOC organizations, and the trust that needs to be built. You know, we talk about, or at least the quote I always use is, you know, we learn through an accumulation of lessons, but we change through an accumulation of practices. That was Adrienne Marie Brown. And, you know, I would just like to see, I feel like we've all learned our lessons, as we should have anyway, as long as we've been doing this work. And you know, last year, 2020, really exacerbated some of the inequalities that we've been able to see. And now it's just trying to put those ideas and what we've been, you know, once you get the information from our communities, to start putting these things into practice. I just want to be able to see a foundation for once not for once, because I've only been this for about a year, but I do want to continue to see, because what I've heard a lot is that a lot of this is performative, and it's just something that, you know, they're doing because this is the time to do it, and because it's the cool thing to do or be in. And I neither want to be around an organization or support an organization that's just doing it for clout. But I want to see it. I actually want to see the practices being implemented both internally, because this is what needs to start anyway. I can care less what it looks like on the outside if it's not really truly coming internally from the inside. And again, that equity analysis, that equity audit through your organization, both from the top all the way down, if anything from the top all the way down, in the center and all around. And so I don't think it's overly complicated. I know that, you know, if organizations have been doing something for so long and it's become so inherent a part of their culture, and it just and they've been successful at it for so long without actually having to support either BIPOC or organization, things like that. And despite of these challenges, I would just like to see it, you know, I guess I lost my train of thought there, but I just would like to continue to see the practice being implemented. And yeah, I just hope that, I guess to end it here, I would just hope that I can see an organization seeing these issues, because it's not like they're not known. It's very apparent. I mean, there's stats everywhere. You listen to enough people. It's not rocket science. Now it's just trying to put those things into practice.
Thanks, Jason. Erica or Nataki, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in just a little bit. I know Nataki has more experience when it comes to grant writing and you know, foundational conversations. But as I'm leaning more into that in this new position at Powershift Network, what I'm noticing, or what I've been thinking a lot about is you know, the differences between, you know, what are we seeing as success? So our philanthropic partners and foundations that are funding the work, what are they seeing as success? So if what we're seeing as success is the numbers game, you know, how many people participated in this, you know, event or that event. And I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong. I'm just really, it's more of a thought, kind of more of a critical thinking question than a yes or no. But what are we seeing as success? Because we want to engage with, you know, as many people as possible and get the word out as much as we can, and, you know, engage or get as many participants to the event or the campaign or whatever as possible. But sometimes when we lean too much into the numbers game of how many people are engaging with the event, we're not focusing as much on the quality of the engagement. And so I say all that to say, you know, looking differently at climate change based on the question we had previously about systemic racism and how that connects people, you know, how that is connected to climate change. And then thinking about how foundations are looking at differently, you know, should we be looking more at the way that communities are affected by the different things that are being funded or the different projects that are being funded? Should we look more at the way that communities are, you know, what programs are being implemented in community, how those community members or citizens not only are being brought into the program in the implementation phase, but in the planning phase? You know, I have an interesting relationship with the word, or with the idea around campaigns, because oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes organizations, you know, kind of, as we all know, parachute into a community, and, you know, because there was a foundation, you know, because there was a project that, or a campaign that was started. And so they parachute into a community to do all this work and to make partnerships, and then kind of leave when the money has run out. And so, you know, I just have an interesting relationship with the word campaigns and the way that certain organizations utilize that campaign model. But we're talking about we should be talking about long-term quality and authentic engagement with community that looks at community members, or looks at the folks that are being affected as partners from the planning stage, as partners from the idea stage, and not just have them coming to the table once the project or whatever the case may be is implemented. And then how is that continued beyond this one particular grant? I would also say that foundations should look differently at climate change, or climate change work should look differently at it from a long-term funding perspective. There's a lot of foundations from now being on the other side and being kind of on the more executive leadership side of things and seeing how grants are grants are being offered, or different granting opportunities are coming about. And the tide is changing, but for a long time there, it was this project. We don't fund operational budgets. This is a project that we're funding. You have to have your own operations budget. Everything in your budget or line items needs to be for the implementation of this project. And while that's important, how are we funding the organizations? How are foundations and philanthropic partners funding the organizations that are doing the long-term relationship building work? I'm gonna embarrass / shout out Nataki and the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance, which is an organization that I started volunteering at when I was in college, which really made me really want to go into this work full time. And West Atlanta Watershed Alliance has been around in Atlanta for a long time. And the work and the relationship that they have built with the community, where the OAC, where they work out of, is physically, but also just the community, metaphorically, the relationship building and the work that Wawa has put in is long-term, it's decades long. And so we should be funding organizations that are building long-term relationships. And so the tide is changing, I think, with foundations, not just funding a project and saying we're not funding operational budgets in any way, but it needs to change more, especially with organizations that are that are funding or that are investing their time in underserved communities. And we really need to increase that. And so they should look at climate change differently, not just from a project standpoint of, how many solar panels are we putting in this community, or how much energy are we shifting in this community, but really, how is the community being benefited on a long-term basis? And what are the relationships that are being built that can create long-term change, both from a community project engagement standpoint on up to, or I should say on over to, because it's not vertical, I think it's horizontal, on over to policy as well. And how are, the long-term policy fights happening that aren't just this one law or this one policy that's being enacted, but how are we shifting the tides, hopefully shifting the tides of the way that the government looks at our city government, not just federal government, because that's definitely can be harder and need, even longer term, but just even city government is looking at climate change and how they're mitigating when it comes to climate, not only climate disasters, but climate infrastructure and things like that. So I just think we need to be looking at it from a more long-term perspective and really investing the money in the community organizations that are investing the time from a long-term perspective into making the changes that need to happen.
Thanks, Erica. I do want to move on to the next question. I'm going to ask Nataki to start us, and that is, how can funders educate themselves on the issues of this historic and current racism and climate philanthropy and grassroots change activism in a way that leads them to rebuild the trust with BIPOC leaders and the community at large?
Thank you for that question. I think, participating in a webinar like the one that is being hosted today is, one way that funders can begin to educate themselves. I would also really encourage them to, do some of this relationship building, with community-based organizations, with BIPOC-led organizations. And, when you do it, though, do it with some intentionality. I'm not suggesting just kind of having, maybe a listening session just to hear from people and then, kind of go in a black room and kind of make some decisions. But as funders are starting to think about how they might show up a little bit more in this space, how they might increase the percentage of BIPOC-led organizations that they're funding, how they might be able to look at kind of the ways that climate change is intersecting with racial equity work. Think about it, in terms of the decisions that your foundation or organization is going to be making. How can you utilize some of these voices in your own decision making, and do it in a way in which there might be some meaningful outcomes to some of these leaders that you might reach out to. But I can definitely say, as Erica said, sort of the tide is changing, and I wear a couple of different hats. So I teach at Spelman College, but as Erica, alluded to, I'm also engaged with a community-based organization. And I will say over this last year and a half or so, that we're starting to get, from the nonprofit perspective, more calls from foundations who, want to build relationships with us, who want to talk with us, understand our work a little bit more. And we've been an organization that, even though we have been doing the work, for over 2 decades, there's some foundations that, for which we had not registered on their radar screen for a number of reasons. And when they began to ask themselves these questions about, well, how many BIPOC-led organizations are we funding? And they found that number was not that large. They started reaching out. They started asking for suggestions and recommendations about organizations that do the work that they traditionally, fund, but maybe that they hadn't had an acquaintance to meet. And so they began to reach out. And when I talk about that intentionality, they began to reach out to look for opportunities to increase their funding, in this space, and to BIPOC-led organizations. So while there wasn't necessarily this, at day one, this promise that we're definitely going to fund you, I think they had some intentionality. They were respectful in that relationship building. They haven't been, haven't been asking for too much. And in the, I won't say in the end, because it's a journey, but in terms of some of those, cases where people and foundations have reached out to us, now they are either considering us for funding, or they've already made a decision to fund us. So this is kind of a, sort of a dig deep, sort of, case by case, basis relationship building. But, these are the types of things that can, be, I think, really beneficial. And then I would just maybe add as a last thing that there are networks of BIPOC-led organizations working on climate justice and climate change issues really across this country. Sometimes they might be local networks, but they span all the way from the local to the national. And so connecting with some of those networks would also be a way. In many cases, they're putting on webinars, they're having conferences and meetings, they're having opportunities, where those BIPOC-led, organization leaders, are speaking, and they might even, provide a platform for people from, foundations to talk about their work, and for, these BIPOC-led organizations to get to know those foundations a little bit better. So there are lots of ways that these exchanges can happen if, foundations are willing and are interested enough. The resources are out there so that you can become a lot more knowledgeable and have what you learn impact and influence, how you give moving forward.
Thanks, Nataki. Related to the former question, this is going to be for all of you, and we'll start with Erica. In addition to educating themselves and doing some of the things that Nataki just laid out, what are 3 practical things foundations can do right now to address race and climate change? And Erica, let's start with you.
Yeah, three practical things. I always struggle with numbers, with things that are numbered. 3 practical things that foundations can do right now. I think, something that Nataki mentioned of, making sure that they are reaching out to organizations. She just mentioned, foundations reaching out to WAWA, not only saying we're interested in funding you all or potentially interested in funding you all, but what are the other organizations we should be paying attention to? So I definitely think that is something that foundations can do. So reaching out to if you all are already funding, even if it's 1 or 2, BIPOC-led organizations or Black-led organizations reaching out and saying, what are the other organizations in your community or outside of community that are doing similar or just as impactful work, and having those conversations. I think most definitely, and I've mentioned this quite a bit, actually having being prompted to think more about something like this on another webinar or conversation that you all hosted, thinking about the way that foundations require proposals as well as reporting. I was thinking, someone mentioned on one of these conversations that you all hosted, I was on with other nonprofit organizations, and it was like nonprofits were there as well as funders were there to listen. And, someone mentioned, how are we requiring proposals and how are we requiring reporting? So oftentimes, not always, I want to be clear that there are some decently funded, I guess, BIPOC-led organizations, but we know that, just as equity is often in, society, we know that the scales are tipped where there are not nearly as many, BIPOC-led organizations that are well funded or funded sufficiently. But they're often small. They have, I'm making a generalization, but they're often small. They have, a lot of volunteers who work there. There's folks that are on contract or not necessarily like paid employees that have benefits and things like that. We have to think about, we're thinking about the ways that climate change intersects. We're also thinking about, capitalism and the way that, the way that people make money and how are they being able to fund the work that they want to do. And so with that being said, the second thing is, thinking about, is the reporting a long report that has all of these things that are needed and bells and whistles, or is the reporting more of a conversation? There are some funders who have done away with formal reports when it comes to the end of a grant period. And so is the reporting more conversational? So, and certainly, we all live in this country together. So, everybody has to, report to the federal government in different ways about how, the money is being spent or made or whatever have you. But what can you kind of take off or alleviate from these organizations that spend most of their time or need to spend most of their time doing the work? Because there are definitely organizations that I've ran into. Powershift Network is a network of many different youth organizations. And so there are definitely conversations where we have had with our network members about, not necessarily being able to pause to do this long report, because they are doing the work. They're spending the time doing the work. So that's the second thing, is thinking about proposals and reporting and how can we decolonize that whole process, the process of proposing for money and the process of reporting after the money's been spent. And then the third thing is, and I hope I'm answering your question, Jasmine, but the third thing I think is definitely thinking about the long term, as I was saying before, the long-term funding, the long-term relationship building, the long-term funding that isn't just a 6-month project, or isn't just a 6-month campaign, but is investing in this organization that invests time in the community over the course of some years. Because we have seen, and I have seen definitely both in previous organizations that I've worked with, but definitely at Powershift, I have seen what a difference multi-year funding can make, and what a difference multi-year investment in an organization can make as they are working towards different types of goals, or as they are working through equity. A former coworker of mine would say equity is a way, not a what. And so as they are working through equity, what is, and to kind of some of our end result or end goals, if you will, how are we funding and supporting those organizations through equity to these end goals? And so, those are 3 ways. I think those are 3 kind of ways that we can start, or that foundations can start really making a difference in the portfolios and the way that they're funding BIPOC organizations that more often than not are advantages, or funding these organizations are more often than not creating advantages and opportunities for BIPOC communities. And so we definitely need to think about the way that we're thinking about funding, and it doesn't have to all be cookie cutter. Here's the call for proposals, there's the proposal being written, here's the time frame for the money being spent, and here's the big long, 5 or 6 page report that's being written, that everyone, is everyone reading? That's another thing. Are we requiring folks to write these long reports, and then not everybody is really combing through it and reading? Maybe they are, but I would venture to say that maybe they're not.
Thank you, Eric. And as a former foundation officer, I read all my reports. Jason, how about you?
Oh, I mean, everything that was just mentioned was just so great, because as a new business owner who's trying to go through my strategic planning, all of my employees, or I would say volunteers, right? They all volunteer. We all work full-time jobs. We dedicate ourselves to the work outside of our regular jobs to do this work. And I can remember, just having to apply for a grant at one point, and it would take us about 2 weeks to get through that. It would take that long just to, go through the process. Sometimes I think even almost a month to try to get all the details together and things like that. So it's a lot of time. It's exhausting. That battle fatigue is real. And so we're in a space that, again, I think if we can alleviate some of that stress and get some of the help, that capacity planning and resources to help with that would be amazing. I think one of the things that you had mentioned was the relationship building, which is so important, because I work with Outdoor Afro as well. And I'm their alumni at this point, but I also used to be a leader in Colorado. And again, as I mentioned before, we always say, or Rumat will always say, the founder of Outdoor Afro, trust happens at the speed of relationships. And this sense of urgency is no longer persuasive anymore, in my opinion. I don't want to be rushed. I have no interest in trying to rush this work that has taken, since I can remember in history, how we gotten to this point. And so if I'm trying to create a new system that's regenerative, that's circular for my community, it's a whole new system. This is new. This isn't something that, okay, you're trying to find impact in 6 months. Get away here. I don't want to hear that. So and to go fast and to have a sense of urgency for what, so we can just go in circles, because usually that's the case anyway. I think, some of the issues I have seen with, even the process of the application process for grantees is the fact that, I've seen a lot of times where these smaller organizations are competing with larger organizations. So that in its sense is inequitable. And so how do you, reframe that where if it is a competitive grant, we're doing that, with people who are on the same level as our organization. So that makes sense. Because when I see someone wins a grant and I see that they're a large institution that already had all this money, it's just like, oh, that's who I was going against. It makes sense, and then again, I say this from a perspective, and I've said this multiple times, from a perspective of someone who is new into the space, because I think it's very important for everyone to kind of understand where I'm coming from, and to see a new face in this field, and understand, just kind of what I'm seeing from that lens. And I think, let me see, I think those are 2 things. I didn't get to 3, but I think at the end of the day, relationships are always going to be important to me. Get on the ground. At Outdoor Afro, someone's always trying to get us to do something for them. And I'm just like, come and meet us, hang out with us, spend time, do quarterly check-ins, get to know my family. I'm BIPOC. My family is very important. And I'm sure for everyone, it's very important. So building those relationships and making sure I can trust you is very important. And so if you're not doing that, it's really hard. Miscommunication can happen really quickly. And last thing I would just mention, I would say also, looking at the community at large and where the power is coming from, sharing some of that power. And what I mean by that is, there's political power, there's executive position power that, that could allow us to make these decisions for our own communities. You know, so often I see foundation who has researchers that are not from our communities or who don't look like me. I want a researcher who is going to be researching me, who already knows me. You know, it creates biases and things like that. So, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Jason. Nataki, you had a list earlier. Is there anything you wanted to add to it before we get to our final question?
Yeah, I would just say look for the innovators in terms of, you know, groups that are doing this climate justice and racial equity work. Sometimes those innovators might not be the ones who are most well funded, but they're getting important work done. So look for them. And then I'd also just really encourage foundations to think very innovatively and creatively about what they do. Don't be afraid to break the mold and do something different than what has traditionally been done. In some cases, you know, that might mean, you know, developing, you know, one line of funding in which, you know, you are looking at some capacity building grants. I think it was Jason who talked about, you know, kind of the larger organizations that sometimes have that ability to swoop in and get all the money, even if they're working in those BIPOC, you know, communities. And so, you know, I would say that the people who are closest to the problems are often closest to the solutions. So don't just give the money to the organizations that, you know, are seen to have, you know, a lot of capacity, or the organizations that have always been funded. Look for those other organizations who are closest to the problem, who have, you know, the solution in their grasp as well, and try to fund those organizations, even if that means trying to change up or needing to change up the way that you currently, you know, do your funding. So, you know, be creative, be flexible, look for ways internally to make some changes so that, you know, you can increase that number of BIPOC-led organizations and get closer to the intersection of these issues. If we're talking about addressing some of these root causes of climate change, then we've got to, you know, do something that gets a little bit closer to where these problems are originating.
Great, thank you. And the last question before we open up for questions and conversation, and please anyone post your questions in the chat if you have something already in mind. And as our speakers wrap up with their final comments, please post questions or thoughts in the chat box. So, big sky thinking, from the perspective of your area of expertise and your experience, what is your vision of racially equitable climate justice? And let's start with Jason.
It's one that is circular, it's one that's regenerative, it's one that is I heard a quote, what did it say? It said, if it ain't for all, it's not for us. and that's the way I feel about it, even in this space. And you know, I just don't see, if the companies are not focusing on socially responsible, and not or not socially responsible, or not helping if your product or your service is not helping the least marginalized, I just don't know what we're doing here. You know, and we are one people. We have a shared humanity. And you know, this system that we live in is a very hard thing to fight. You know, considering that it's a lot of it is based off of profit and the exploitation of resources and people. And I just want to see us do better by us. And you know, it's hard. That's why, you know, sometimes you can get discouraged. But this is also why I create my own system that is different than what's currently being presented to me, because it hasn't been helpful both to myself or the people that I love. And so it's trying to find a way out of that. So again, I think to create a more just and bright future for all of people, that it needs to be centered in a regenerative circular process that is helping everyone, starting with the most marginalized.
Thanks, Jason. Nataki, how about you?
So I would just add to what Jason was mentioning in terms of this circular regenerative economy, that we've got to think about the root causes of climate change, the root causes of racial inequities and injustices. And in some ways we find this, you know, the same things at, you know, the root of both of these. And so I think if we're talking about, having a racially just, sort of focus on these issues, then we got to deal with root problems, not just, symptoms. So that means structures, have to be dismantled and reimagined, thought of in a different way and implemented, in a different way. As we address climate change, we've got to, look at those disproportionate impacts to BIPOC, communities, and not just focus on, this or that piece of the science. And while the science is critical, and I am a scientist, but we cannot ignore the intersection of, the politics and, the other things that go along with those scientific issues. And so if we are talking about a future that, looks just, with respect to how we deal with these issues, then root causes is the way that we've got to go. We've got to address those root causes. And, as Erica, I think, mentioned, earlier, that means we've got to examine capitalism. We've got to look at people over profit. Part of why it seems so difficult, to talk about, an economy in which we are not so reliant on things like fossil fuels. It's about economics. And so we've got to look at these systems, in tandem with one another and address, the root causes of these inequalities.
Thank you, Nataki. And Erica, anything you want to add? What's your vision?
Yeah, I won't repeat anything that anyone's already said. I think Jason and Nataki both made some really good points. I just wanted to also talk about in relation to the work that we do at Powershift Network, not just at Powershift Network, though, the work that I've been doing. And when it comes to youth engagement, I think Black and Indigenous people of color and also young people that fall into those categories are definitely making a lot of waves when it comes to climate justice, when it comes to looking at capitalism, as Nataki just said, and thinking about the interesting ways in which we can, mitigate the fact that climate change is not coming, but it is already here. And, the young people are really thinking about, their future. And, I used to consider myself the young people, but having worked, and I'm in my early 30s, but having, even working with folks that are, just out of high school, just going to college, just thinking about, or just college age, I should say, and are thinking about the future and policies that they are going to have to either benefit from in the future or work to change in the future as they become policymakers. So what it looks like for me, and I'll be short because I know we're short on time, but what it looks like for me is a multi-generational approach to climate justice work, not just a multi-community approach and not just with BIPOC communities at the forefront as fence line and frontline communities, but also with young people that are in those fence line and frontline communities, young people of color, young Black people, young Indigenous people who are really thinking about the land, who are really thinking about the land where we live, thinking about the way that we're going to have to mitigate our communities for climate change that is already here, and thinking about how are they going to have to, again, benefit or work to change harmful policies that are being enacted now or that are being drawn up now. So it looks to me like a multi-generational approach, and it looks to me like foundations funding diverse communities and diverse ages of leaders when it comes to the now, but also the future that our young people are already looking towards. And the way that they're looking at how they are going to exist in the world, both from their own, personal standpoints, from, their socio-political standpoints, and policy standpoints. How are they going to exist in the world, and how are they going to have to bear the burden of the work that that's being done now?
Great. Well, thank you to all three of you. And we're going to open up for questions and conversation. We have about 8 minutes or so before we close. And if folks are able to come off or come on to video, we'd love to see your faces. And if you want to raise your hand to ask a question to get us started, please feel free to do so. or you can just come off mute and jump on in.
All at once now.
Exactly. Yeah, Megan, I see you.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm interested in any perspectives you might have to offer on roles philanthropies can play in bringing together groups that are working at the very much at the grassroots movement level with other organizations that are kind of more working at whether it's the grass tops kind of bigger, traditionally at least in often more white-led organizations, and thinking about ways of networking to build kind of a broader strengthening connections between, and thinking about how to, so often what's happening at state level advocacy, at least in our area in Maine, is it's not at all informed by BIPOC and grassroots organizations, and how roles we can play to strengthen those connections.
And who wants to start that?
I was looking at Erica since she works with all these networks, but I'll take a stab at it. I think part of what can be done is looking at the networks that exist. So in terms of kind of BIPOC-led organizations, especially those who do a lot of work at the grassroots level, there are a number of networks, kind of across the country. So one network that I'm aware of is the Environmental Justice Forum, which is convened by We Act for Environmental Justice. And so We Act is a BIPOC-led organization, but as BIPOC-led organizations go, I would say that they are well-funded, have a great deal of capacity. They're working from the grassroots level all the way up to the federal policy level. And so they are a great example of one such organization that does a great job of convening and helping to build capacity of grassroots-based organizations. And so connecting with an organization like We Act and the members of the EJ Forum, come from across the country, that would be one such really good organization that is already, trying to invest, but that could also help, I think, connect other groups that, are, wider, have, greater financial and other capacity. You could, also work, through those types of networks to get connected. So that's just kind of one thought, as opposed to just looking at individual organizations, go to some of these networks that are designed to bring together BIPOC-led organizations. And they may be good, candidates for looking at how to, connect them to some of these other networks that you might be a lot more aware of and maybe have some stronger relationships with.
We were looking at each other, Nataki. I was looking at Nataki to answer this. I can say from a network, from someone who leads a network myself, I think, and also is a part of a couple of networks. So Powershift Network is a member of the Southeast Climate and Energy Network, SEN, as well as U.S. Climate Action Network, or USCAN. And USCAN does a really good job of bringing organizations together that are doing different, similar type of work to kind of have more of a broader impact. I think they do a pretty good job of that, and we love the folks at USCAN. Kaya and her staff there are really wonderful, and also are really great about taking from their members and other partners, and taking those ideas and helping them make them a thing and run with them. And so again, we love the folks over at USCAN a lot. From our perspective and in our network, I think I think something that philanthropic partners can do is look for those networks of organizations, or look for those networks that are their own organization, that are naturally bringing folks together for various reasons, or that is, a mutually beneficial relationship with member organizations, and thinking about, what does the partnership look like, as a philanthropic organization that wants to fund more partnership work, or create a greater impact from a grassroots level, partnering with organizations that have the internal infrastructure of already bringing people together, and different models of how we do that. And we certainly at PSN have different models of how we bring organizations together. And so, partnering with these different types of networks to create spaces or incubators or whatever have you, where organizations both inside that network, but also outside that network, because it could be a mutually beneficial relationship where you could be bringing more organizations inside that network, and also bringing more organizations to the work that your foundation is trying to fund, that wouldn't necessarily know about those opportunities. So a really great way, I think, would be to connect to networks that already exist, and either connecting your funded organizations to those networks, or partnering with those networks to create spaces, either formally or informally, where folks can have conversations and look at ways where they can connect. I'll just say really quickly, we are relaunching at Powershift Network. It existed a long time ago in another model, but we're relaunching mini grants, or granting organizations and projects with money that's passed through our organization, or passed through PSN, central staff, if you will. And so we are trying to build our foundational portfolio to fund these mini grants to actions or projects or campaigns or whatever that some of our network members want to do. And so there could be ways where other networks are doing similar things, where philanthropic partners can partner and create those, like I said, formal or informal spaces where support, financial support is pouring in, and also there's a swell of impact and capacity that can be lent to different projects, campaigns, and actions that are happening in different communities.
So thank you, Megan, and Nataki had also added a comment about the Anthropocene, I hope I said that, Alliance. And Jason, I don't know if you wanted to add anything else in the last minute or so before we wrap up.
No, I can make a real quick statement. I think it's as simple as having a genuine interest in other people's work and who they are and the work they're doing. Like, it just starts with you and your organization. You don't even have to, you obviously have to do the research and figure out who's out there. But some people would call me a serial networker. And I just genuinely had an interest in other people and their work that they were doing. And I made myself available. I have people who tell me, oh, you show up and you're just there. You always are here, or you're there. It's because I just show up. I show up for the community, and people, and because I show up, people want to get involved, or people want me to get involved, and things like that. I'm one of the few Black men, actually I only know one other one, that actually works in state government in policy. And that's surprising to me. And I'm like, where are we? But I've been able, through that network, being able to get other organizations to partner and come together collectively because of the work I already had did prior and the time that I put into building those relationships.
I like that phrase, serial networker, which is something that I am not as an introvert. So thank you, everyone, for your participation. Thank you to our speakers for taking the time out today. Learned a few great phrases like green space gentrification, and Nataki reminded me of an feature article in National Geographic a couple of months ago about urban heat spots. That was very interesting. I learned a lot about how disinvestment in green spaces in a lot of cities are leading to these problems in urban areas, particularly underserved urban areas. So thank you for enlightening us, for bringing some new perspective into the conversation. Many of you will receive, all of the participants at least will receive a link to a brief evaluation of today's session. And Please take a few minutes to complete it. Your input is something that we do truly use for planning these webinars. The final webinar in this series will take place in November to address where we are a year from the election. We are confirming dates and speakers right now, so stay tuned on the InDEEP website to learn of that date and who will have joining us. And the recording of this webinar will be posted on the InDEEP website within a few days. So please feel free to share it with your friends once it's posted, maybe watch it again to pick up on some things that you may have missed before. So we are at time. We thank everyone again for their participation, and thanks for our speakers for your wonderful insights. And I hope that you all have a great rest of the day and rest of the week.
Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you.